So maybe we'll get started in about a moment.
Sounds good.
Right.
Word, and I'll stop sharing.
Take it away, Ava.
Gosh, okay. Let me get this pulled up. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event hosted by the Digital Sociology Lab. My name is Ava Hauge. I'm the lab's event coordinator and blog manager. Thank you for attending our discussion on MLMs, misinformation, and gendered radical recruitment strategies in the context of QAnon. Before we begin, allow me to introduce our speakers for today's event. Please welcome Dr. Gina Marie Longo, an assistant professor of sociology at Virginia Commonwealth University and co-founder of the Digital Sociology Lab. She received her PhD in sociology with a PhD minor in religious and ethnic conflict from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her master's degree in political science from Florida Atlantic University. Dr. Longo's research focuses on how users construct and police gender, race, and nation in digital spaces and its implications for our physically situated world. Her work has been featured in venues such as Gender and Society, Migration Politics, the Journal of Family Relations, Miss Magazine, and the London School of Economics U.S. Center. Joining her today is Dr. Frankie Mastrangelo, Assistant Chair of the Sociology Department at Virginia Commonwealth University and co-founder of both the Digital Sociology Lab and the Billion Worlds Lab. The Billion Worlds Lab is dedicated to liberatory study, research, organizing, and teaching. Their work challenges traditional academic structures and aims to expand our understanding of the world in unconventional ways. Dr. Mastrangelo received her PhD in Interdisciplinary Studies, Media, Art, and Text from Virginia Commonwealth University and her master's degree in Media, Cinema, and Digital Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. Mastrangelo's research and teaching examines the intersections of racial capitalism and digital cultures. Her work has been featured in publications such as Ephemera, Bitch Media, and Teaching Resistance. She has been interviewed by the Washington Post, Huffington Post, and Today for sociological perspectives on pop culture and media. Recently, Dr. Gina Marie Longo and Dr. Frankie Mastrangelo collaborated on the article Downlining Disinformation, How MLM Distributors Use Gendered Strategies for Recruitment and Pastel QAnon Indoctrination. Our moderator this evening is Janus Chidester, a Digital Sociology Lab Fellow and recent Virginia Commonwealth University Sociology alumni. Janus graduated in December with a bachelor's in sociology and a certificate in disability studies and is currently awaiting decisions for admission to graduate school. Congratulations. Janus' research interests are the construction of deficit narratives of disability and the role that digital infrastructures play in countering and reproducing those narratives. His work on the history of labor relations in the U.S. has been featured in Octus, the Journal of Undergraduate Research and Creative Scholarship. Lastly, I want to recognize Dr. Tara Stam, who will be facilitating the chat discussion and highlighting questions and comments to bring forward to the larger group. Dr. Stam teaches the new course that you may have noticed in the slide deck titled Cults and New Religious Movements that explores the cultish dynamics of modern U.S. society. So, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Gina Marie Longo, Dr. Frankie Mastrangelo, and Janus Chidester.
Yay.
Thank you, Ava. I'm so glad to be here to talk to both of you. We've all worked together in the past, but we did not work together on this particular project. So it was a delight for me to read, just seeing what awesome things you two are working on. And it's a delight to be able to talk about it more in depth with you here in this forum. So first of all, congratulations. I believe it was published this month, right? In Social Media and Society. Very exciting.
long time in the coming, it felt like, didn't it, Frankie?
Yeah, it was part
But
of a special collection, so it took a while for the whole collection to get finalized. And there was a moment where Gina and I were like, is this still happening? And so it was that much more celebratory when it came out.
Oh, good. Um, so I kind of wanted to hear from both of you just to kind of get things rolling. I was curious, sort of what motivated both of you individually to like pursue this particular line of research, kind of looking into how disinformation is spread through like an MLM structure and how it connects to Pastel QAnon. It's like what drove you into that direction, if you don't mind talking about it.
Yeah, so I could start off with, us, thinking through that. So my dissertation research was centered around theorizing girl boss culture. So thinking about the cultural image of the girl boss and the broader social and political stakes of, that cultural image becoming so familiar and disseminating throughout pop culture and really grounding our understandings of feminism. So, like, stay with me here of how I got to MLMs and disinformation. So, throughout my dissertation research, I started to, essentially think about the different threads of girl boss feminism and defining girl boss feminism as, equating feminist advancement with getting money, essentially, and, getting a piece of the capitalist pie. And so, with that, I started looking at different cultural spaces and thinking about these particular cultures of capitalism. So, first thinking about self-help coaching, thinking about wellness influencers, and thinking about multi-level marketing. And y'all could probably see how those spaces came to become very intertwined and overlap. But thinking about with all those connections, what ideological foundations are grounding them, and thinking about, what material conditions are grounding them as well and why that matters. So with that, I wanted to, after I submitted my dissertation and, put that chapter of my life behind me, I was thinking about, MLMs for a while more heavily. So thinking about that chapter of my dissertation and thinking about what I could do with that aspect of the research that I started. And with that, I started talking to Gina, as I, was drafting this particular article. And, Gina helped in such a big way as I started thinking through the ways that algorithmic bias was factoring into MLMs and why people turn to them, how economic precarity ties into that, and then specifically thinking about, why it was so important to consider the role that MLMs played in, disseminating different forms of disinformation. So then, just because Gina and I love talking with one another, the the article really grew from there, and we just, started thinking through different, threads of, this particular research together.
yeah, and what made this article and this work really intriguing for me is well, first of all, as a digital sociologist, I'm always fascinated by the flow of different forms of information, and I'm very interested in these sort of feedback loops that happen due to algorithmic bias. And one of the things that we look at a lot is we do pull apart a lot about disinformation, that there's a lot of literature out there, but discussing a lot of radicalization and these sort of phenomenons that happen online, there's this sort of it seems like gender, when we talk about gender, it's usually looking at the roles of men, male-bodied people, and how that's kind of the gendered aspect of female-bodied people and and women in particular gets a little bit more on the muted side. And I had seen a lot of pastel QAnon phenomenon, the softer side of QAnon, where they're trying to entice a certain kind of woman into the movement. I found that really fascinating, especially as Frankie and I started looking over the data. And gender is one of those things that's near and dear to my heart. So when Frankie and I started talking about the intersections of, the different ideologies that were playing into it, the different, precarities involved, and then the gendered aspects of what we're bringing people into MLMs and also into the pastel QAnon movement, that's where I really got hooked. And just conversating with Frankie, we began to recognize that there was, this pattern here. And what I always get fascinated with when I approach articles and stuff like this is it's very easy to initially have a preconceived notion about who gets involved in medical disinformation and why they do. It could be, you have, you think that it's sort of a particular political ideology, or, or you could think about it as a particular group of people, and that a lot of people are just simply bamboozled, or they're not necessarily educated enough to know the difference between, sound science and misinformation. And as we were uncovering a lot of the data and going through it, and reading through the literature, recognizing that misinformation, there's different sectors of how medical misinformation and things like conspirituality theories happen. It's, even though we're studying a particular group of people, things like, anti-vaxxing is not just something that is, a more right-leaning ideology, right? This is something that also is present in like, more lefty, politics and ideologies. And it's so there's a spectrum out there, and finding that spectrum and understanding that people, it wasn't just about people having misinformation, but and that they couldn't tell the difference, but that there were really big sociological structures going on, like sexism and elitism and racism in our medical and healthcare system, really helped me think through some of these reasons as to why people are consuming this medical misinformation. And so I was so glad that Frankie said, hey, come on to this paper with me, because I was able to explore those and really think through and push back against my own preconceived notions about why people consume medical misinformation. And this is one of the great parts about being a digital sociologist, is that the data just continues to surprise me.
Yeah. And so I wonder too, if like before we get started, it could be helpful to offer kind of a TLDR of the article. If people, I'm not going to assume that everybody got a chance to read this, like social media and society piece, but we can definitely, link it in the chat if, this is your first foray into, hearing about this particular topic. But it was funny, yesterday I was offering kind of a summation of our article in a way that was not using any theoretical jargon, and thinking about people may already be familiar with this particular pipeline that exists between wellness cultures. So to follow Olivia's point in the chat, like granola moms, like people that you may see on social media that are like, even like what is termed like the trad wife aesthetic. So people that are kind of engaging these different forms of traditional gender roles, but really attempting to do everything in ways that are avoiding what they term big pharma, what they term, different forms of poison at grocery stores, etc. But we were thinking with this article about specifically where the granola moms and where the, the wellness folks overlap then with what is termed Pastel QAnon. So, what is referred to as, the gendered dimensions of alt-right radicalization pipeline. So different forms of conspiracy thinking, which, involve a wide range of, different forms of conspiracy thought. So it's, thinking about everything from like Avril Lavigne is a plant and that she actually died at some point, thinking about different forms of conspirituality. So thinking about, satanic cabals and all of this stuff, but generally like reducing it down to, as it relates to our work, it's, essentially thinking about how the tumbling effect into alt-right conspiracy theories aligns with wellness conspiracy theories. So like the process can go a little something like this. Like, I like lavender oil. It's a cure-all that works better than vaccines. Now I have a garage full of lavender oil that I'm trying to sell to my friends. But very often that kind of tumbling into disinformation looks a little more like this. And we learned this from the data, that it's more like, I like lavender oil. It's a cure-all. There's a satanic cabal preventing us from knowing this about lavender oil, and the friends that I bought lavender oil from showed me that the people at the insurrection had good points. So like where these, wild different forms of conspiracy thinking kind of form that meme where it's like, people shaking hands, like wellness conspiracies and, alt-right thinking. So, that's kind of offering an overview of what we were getting at with this article. And then as we talk with Janus, we'll start to unpack some of the key threads of it. And yeah, thank you, Tara, for offering some, a bit of a glossary in the chat for us.
Yeah, and thank you for going over like a accessible overview of the paper too. Like I think that's really helpful. And even for folks who have read it, I think having the like really easy to understand short elevator version is helpful just for wrapping your head around the concept. And that was something that that you said like really connected with me as well. Just talking about how it is sort of like a really broad umbrella of people who can fall into this sort of I guess you could call it a trap, but these sort of circles of misinformation have many entryways. Like I don't think that either of you know this about me, but I grew up in a family that was very distrustful of medical institutions, and this was in the 90s and 2000s, so QAnon was not a thing yet. But reading through your paper, I was seeing a lot of the same patterns that I like remember from childhood, and could identify like the sorts of trip ups that people will fall into to start to see like, yeah, we are not getting proper care from medical institutions. They're not speaking to our needs. We're being told we need stuff we don't think we need. But these alternative medicines, these alternative practitioners are telling us things that we do like and that we agree with. And so it was really wild to read about how you have found in your data how disinformation peddlers will latch onto that instance and use it as a way to connect like conspiratorial thinking and indoctrination to QAnon in this instance. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, since you did mention how like this isn't a phenomenon that's restricted to the right-leaning end of the political spectrum. With vaccines in particular, because that was sort of the entry point for my family, and my family is generally more left-leaning. They vote Democratic all the time, and they don't fit into this like QAnon space, but they do fit into the conspirituality space. So I'm wondering if like you saw in your data any patterns that do relate to that, like people being siloed into different networks of disinformation that maybe speak to more liberal-minded people.
Well, I mean, at least,
You go ahead.
I mean, at least the way that the data that we had looked at primarily, with MLMs, there's not always, but there is a particular genre of groups of people that get involved, and Frankie would know more than this than I do, but this is just what I observed. And so with the MLMs, a lot of people are in a sort of traditional gender roles marriage, right? So their marriages are where women are expected to be at home raising children, being, homemakers. And and when you have children, and a lot of the women would talk about in the data that they had a lot of children with exceptional needs. And what makes it so enticing, and this is one of the things that we found was part of these gendered strategies of how do we get different people into this line of work, right? So how do we get people to initially look at what we're doing here at these MLMs? And so it speaks, and this is a very key point, is that misinformation is not like blanketed. It's like you said, Janice, different groups of people, different, we're all different intersections of identity, right? That create our experience for us. And so with this particular group of people, we were primarily seeing, white evangelical women who were kind of locked in or felt that they were in these very traditional marriages that wouldn't allow for much room outside of the home or outside of this role of caregiving. A lot of them had children with exceptional needs. And you can see that they were looking for something as a way to contribute to their household, how to help their children live their best lives, and how they were they were hearing a lot of their own stories, right? Like it's, anybody who is a mother in particular, when something goes wrong or your child is ill or hurt or has exceptional needs, there's always this blame on the mother, or there's a lot of pressure on the mother to, fix it, quote unquote, or get this sort of thing addressed. And so there is a lot of, guilt and sexism that comes in. And then on top of that, feeling like I need a purpose. And so this was one of the strands. It was called the look. How do these MLM companies get you to look? So once you start hearing your story, it was very easy for people to start to look to the MLM, particularly these essential oils, as a way to, find that there are people that just understood what they were going through in their experiences. And so it's very validating, when someone speaks your truth back to you, you feel a sense of community, you feel a sense of understanding. And so this is one of the ways in which this particular group of people get enticed in. And I do want to mention that we do look, we look at, in terms of race here, and Frankie will talk more about this later. Like we look at whiteness here as like a factor. And, but that's not to say that there aren't other groups of people that are in other MLMs that might be hearing different things or in other avenues. So it's just how these particular women got triaged into looking to the MLM as like, a way to see themselves. And then we'll talk about the next phase of the indoctrination that comes next.
Yeah, I do want to comment on, the thread that you started, Janice, around thinking about left-leaning folks that may also ultimately fall down these radicalization pipelines, because I do think it's really important in, this first round of data collection where, we scrape data where, in other words, we collected a bunch of Instagram, posts as well as tweets. And then, based on those particular forms of content that we gathered, we narrowed it down to identify different themes across the content that we collected. And so, the initial collection was based on, particular particular keywords, so particular hashtags, thinking about specifically COVID, thinking about conspiracy thinking, thinking about wellness. So then with that, it offered the picture that Gina was just highlighting. So thinking about recognizing this, thematic thread of, a particular type of woman that tended to emerge in the data. It was this, evangelical, like stay-at-home mom, that was able to, not necessarily forego different forms of, traditional structures and still contribute to the household. But what I am really interested in looking into as I continue this project, as we continue, thinking through these different threads is, considering, what are potentially, the different histories of the folks that, we're collecting this data around, because I have been really interested, for instance, in, when, and this is anecdotal, but thinking about folks that I've even known that have come from, more left-leaning backgrounds that then find themselves tumbling down the conspiracy thinking spaces. So I think that's where, your points, Janus, are coming in. So thinking about, there's that, the funny meme that's like, when you go so far left, you go right, where it's like, people that, I think, and we talked about this a bit in the article, but recognizing conspiracy thinking as really representing an ideological fork in the road. So recognizing how that fork in the road can take shape as being able to hold space for contradiction. In other words, thinking about, for instance, recognizing that we can critique social institutions, we can critique healthcare spaces and medical establishments, recognize the ways that they reinforce these different forms of systemic oppression like racism, sexism, ableism, but then also recognize that, vaccines have value and recognize that navigating these institutions can help offer, different spaces for folks to, to alleviate harm, to offer, different, forms of, more beneficial health outcomes and so on. So you can hold space for the critique as well as, remaining, recognizing that you can, still navigate those health establishments, in positive ways. Or you can go the route where it's like, thinking about things in these very black and white terms, kind of blanket, statements like all medical and health establishments are bullshit. Like we need to get out of there. Like, simply orange juice at the grocery store is trying to poison us. Like you just like, totally go down that rabbit hole where everything is bad and you need to refrain from, trying to engage in any form of, social institution. So that kind of binary thinking, we see that a lot with conspiracy thought. And I do think that's part of a broader conversation around how we are and are not able to hold contradictions under, different capitalist structures, because I think that very often it lends itself to, just kind of looking for silver bullet solutions, which is what the essential oils offered to many people. It's like, this is the solution. Everything else is bad, but I got my lavender. I'm sorry, the people that were commenting on lavender in the chat are probably like, is this girl gonna keep talking about lavender the whole time? I'm not trying to pick on lavender. I literally have some lavender like Abigail on my desk. So yes, but I think, considering that, these different forms of conspiracy thinking do affect a variety of different groups. And yeah, it's interesting how that takes shape.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Gina's point was very powerful about like the importance of hearing your story being told by someone else, and particularly when that someone else is taking it a step further and telling you that there's maybe something you can do about it. Yeah, I to your point about holding those like contradictory ideas, I wonder if the reason that like this often ends up with people falling into conspiratorial thinking has to do with like, you talk a little bit about a lack of effective counter messaging in the article, and how top-down messaging from authorities and institutions doesn't work because people are already mistrustful of them. And that's the whole point of why these disinformation downlining processes are so effective, It's because they talk to you on your level. They tell you stories that sound like yours, and they offer you solutions. So I know that you recommend, sorry, excuse me. You recommend that like these debunking campaigns, they like adopt similar sorts of strategies that you outline in these MLM recruitment processes. And the thing that I was thinking about when I was reading that was because these MLMs that are doing this recruitment through essential oils and kind of connected to Pastel QAnon, they have a economic structure embedded in them, right? Like they are selling a product and they are bringing in more people to buy that product to sell to other people. I'm wondering what you think about how effective counter messaging campaigns can be without like a comparable funding source, particularly thinking about like where the money is for that sort of campaign is in government and medical institutions, but having a connection to those institutions, I presume, would affect the credibility among the people you're trying to reach. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about like the effectiveness of actually adopting those sorts of strategies as counter messaging.
I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I mean, just saying, I mean, there's still a notion out there. Well, if you just give people the correct information, that will, that's all that they need. But what we really need to do is start certain campaigns where we are addressing some of these issues around what people are actually feeling. We need to let people see their truth in some of these debunking campaign messages. And when we were reading the literature, there was a very powerful article and where they had looked at people who were not necessarily in MLMs, but were anti-vaxxers or vaccine hesitant in certain regions of the country that had a very specific, cultural and socioeconomic background and socio-historical stories that are in their area that made them vaccine hesitant or made them anti-vaxxers. And the campaigns that were used as a way to address those and give the message that these vaccines are safe was actually quite effective. Now, does it get everybody? No. And that's the thing that we need to promote more research on and look at is, and this is hopefully like another phase of research as we're going down the line, is how can we create these campaigns and get people to start getting funding sources to start thinking similarly so that they invest in these kinds of strategies. Because ultimately, when we're all healthy and we're all thriving, then everyone, society as a whole is doing better. So, and it's also more cost effective, less, burden on the healthcare system, more resources to go around for people that, maybe immunocompromised and need those extra resources when we're talking about things like, pandemics and diseases. But I think that, you're right. Like, how do we counter these messages? When you have something like an MLM who is giving you, and this was the second, part of that gendered recruitment strategy was the hook, right? We get you to look and then we hook you with this idea that essential oils is a panacea. And a lot of it was done through, creative YouTube pages and a lot of women that people could see themselves in that had similar home family situations, talking about how, these essential oils were curing depression and helping with autism and fighting against things like COVID. So it was a hook. And then on top of it saying like, look how economically empowered you're going to become because you too can support your family, even though you're at home. So we need to think about how we can adopt some of those modes of the way in which we get information across good sound information, but that's something that, you know, as digital sociologists, we need to do more research on, and we're excited to do that.
Yeah, something that was really interesting that, we found in the literature too was the inclination for social media users to trust influencers with small followings. So thinking about, influencers with followings of, around like 15,000 or less, people that don't have like as much reach as, some of these, broader, really popular influencers. So people that had less of a following that, offer more personal attention through, what Nancy Baim terms, the emotional labor that goes into, how, different influencers will like be in the comment thread, like responding to everyone and developing those relationships. But thinking about with that, leveraging the way that media ecologies function today, because at this point, I know that there's so many conversations around, we would not offer influencers power if we stopped their ability to influence us. So like just stop acknowledging them. And I don't think that's realistic. I think that follows some of the same, media theorist ideologies that, people like, Henry Jenkins have pushed back against, where you can't just like go out into the woods and avoid all forms of media. You need to think about, how to engage with it in smart ways, how to engage with it and the times that you're living in ways that are actually leveraging contemporary media ecologies to, in various ways, think through how we can, create positive social change. So, thinking about, in this particular case, I think about leveraging those media ecologies could take the form of, calling upon the niche micro influencers, whatever, people want to term them, people with smaller followings, and think about people that may have turned a corner and recognized how they were, disseminating different forms of disinformation, and have them talk about it. Because I think about how powerful the, say like different Reddit threads and different, different media spaces where people who used to be in MLMs, they'll create and talk with people who used to be in MLMs, and share their experiences. And that can be, a space of healing for people. It can be a space of camaraderie. So thinking about, potentially creating spaces like that for, people who may have, turned a corner with the ways that they, see disinformation flows, and maybe thinking about their contributions to it. But I imagine that, that population of niche micro influencers that have turned a corner might be small at this point, but, I think that that's definitely an avenue to explore.
I also think, going off of that, and this is something that, some of us sociologists are guilty of. I mean, we often, illuminate problems of inequality and, the social problems of our society, and don't necessarily give a lot of shining hope, right, on the situation. The fact that micro influencers are so very powerful in this particular push for misinformation, there is a lot of room to potentially grow micro influencers from a more scientifically sound perspective, reaching different groups of people. It's like a patchwork quilt, and it doesn't have to be these big, huge dollar amounts in order to do it, right? Like a lot of these people are initially doing it on a shoestring, or they have their own lo-fi recordings, or they're doing these home videos and these, these kinds of micro outreaches. And this is where, the more micro and macro level sociology really is important, because a lot of times we feel overwhelmed by these huge structures, and saying, how can we push back against that? And we're seeing here with disinformation in real time how it really does matter when you have a person with a small following, right? We are looking at more micro actions, and so we can build a force, I believe, that can help combat this medical disinformation, because in part, and this will be the third part, the third strategy is this sort of feedback loop that comes into it, because you then sort of pass the baton. And one of the things that the influencers do very well is say like, well, don't believe me, do the research. And this is a huge hashtag in QAnon in general, is do the research. And what the influencers are essentially doing is telling people how to trick the algorithm into providing these, all of this medical misinformation. And, if you start to hear something long enough, people will tend to start to believe those kinds of things. So if we could find ways to pass the baton, going on to more scientifically sound information and addressing some of these problems, perhaps this will help snowball some of this, combating of medical misinformation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up talking about like the manipulation of algorithms to sort of do a lot of this indoctrination work for them. Because that's such a it's such an ingenious like tool, right? Like the infrastructure is all there for you if you can just tailor it in a specific way. I'm wondering if you think that is like worth harnessing in the opposite direction towards more like accurate and helpful information, or if there's like perhaps room for altering how algorithms play into like the sort of content that we do see and like what is generated for us as individual users in this sort of quest to have less than disinformation.
Frankie?
Would you mind repeating the question? I was
Sure. No worries.
I was reading
understand.
Susan's summary of this really interesting article and I got distracted.
I was starting
No,
to read and
not
was
to
like, oh,
say
I have to
anything
talk
bad
now.
about that. I'm happy that you posted that, Susan.
Yes, thank you. um, sure. I was asking pretty much, do you think there's room for like rethinking how we use algorithms in the delivery of content, and rather than harnessing the existing structure of social media, let's say, to redirect people towards more helpful information, if perhaps part of the issue is the way that content is delivered to us as individual users. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
a summary of what I was getting at.
Yeah, and it does connect to this, point that Susan made in the chat and thinking about root causes of issues. So thinking about, you know, when it comes to algorithmic bias, I feel like it's if we're going to interrogate algorithmic bias, it's important to situate that within a broader understanding of platform capitalism. So if we, are experiencing the need to navigate different platforms that are fundamentally undergirded by a capitalist logic and are, continuously centering revenue above all else, and thinking about how if that is, shaping the logic of the platforms, it's always going to be an uphill battle to, in various ways, use algorithmic knowledge to support different forms of radical social change. So, I think about if, you can't necessarily then, like there's this, example in the article Susan was mentioning of like, you can't just like replace the facts with, or you can't just replace the disinformation with the facts. You need to think about, okay, well, what are the structures that are shaping the flows of information? How is this situated not only within the capitalist logic of platforms, but also thinking about why people, turn to these different forms of, disinformation and then contribute to the, this political economy of, rewards and incentives that, they're, sharing through peer-to-peer distribution networks of MLMs, asking people to do their research, getting them involved in things. So it's important to, think about how precarity is driving that, platform capitalism, the logic of these platforms are driving that, and think about that context in tandem with these questions.
Yeah, I think also too, we need to think also even beyond, right? So, I mean, we are still trying to figure out in our digital age, things like what does it mean to have free speech and who's involved in the industries of, putting together these different algorithmic, the way the algorithm is set up and who's doing some of these, who are the techs out there. And, in part, there's a great book by Dr. Sophia Noble who talks about algorithms of oppression. And talking about like, well, tech is still, very much, white, male, educated group of people. And so there's not a lot of room in there for other voices to come in and think outside of this box of how do we actually fix these things. And the internet, people are just starting to really grasp this. It is itself a social institution. So it is being influenced by other institutions, whether it's the economy, whether it's family, whether it's gender relations, race relations, and so on. But it's also influencing other areas. And so we can start to think and demand, as people who are digital citizens, if you will, we need to really start thinking like, what do we want out of this institution and how do we want to shape it so that we can combat it, not just at this very, we do want to combat it at a micro level. We do want to think through some of these things, but as Frankie was saying, there's like larger implications and we need to attack it from all different avenues. And I'm under the firm belief that it is not impossible to do these things. We see that, despite all of the backlash towards different groups of people and the oppression that we see, we are making headway moving forward, right? Like the reason that we do have so many reactions to, like, let's say, the LGBTQ plus community is because the more that, that group is being, say, embraced in society is like full citizens, people, we see gay marriage now is more accepted. We've done that as a society. We are moving forward. And I think that the thought that we can't fix it, that hopelessness is like what they want us to think because that keeps things stuck. So we really need to like look at our accomplishments and keep moving forward and figure out how we can tackle this from a lot of different avenues so that we can make that change. And I think it's totally possible.
I so appreciate your optimism. Like all the time, I appreciate your optimism, but like just thinking about this topic in particular, because we've been like sort of, or you two have been like talking around it for a while, and Susan brought up about root causes. Like one of the main arguments you have in your article is how it is systemic inequalities that produces the mistrust that people have in these institutions, which leads to this vulnerability that can be exploited by people looking to peddle disinformation and trying to recruit MLM new sellers and such. And acknowledging that the root of that process is these really broad systemic issues that are sort of ephemeral and hard to address head on. It feels overwhelming. It feels impossible. But I do think that you're right. It's important to remember and also to say that it's not impossible. These problems are addressable and that it is worth pursuing and it's worth working towards. So, thank you. I always appreciate your boundless optimism. So I had to get that out. But in that vein, because I know we did want to talk about this, your paper does talk mostly about, because it's the focus you chose, like more, it focuses on white conservative women primarily. And one of the things I was hoping we could talk about is the dimension of race and how that might actually enter into these sorts of processes. And maybe if you saw anything in the data you collected that implicated race as like a dimension here and how it interacts with this disinformation downline. Yeah, I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I will say, first and foremost that I am personally very interested in all of the work that I do in interrogating different dimensions of whiteness. So thinking about, how various folks reinforce, institutions interpersonally. So the various levels that we're reinforcing white supremacy. And I think that very often when we talk about race, we're not, I think that there is this assumption that we're not going to talk about whiteness, but that, whiteness is then considered the default in some way. And I think that in and of itself is violent. So that in and of itself is reinforcing systemic racism. And with this particular project, and generally thinking about how I think a thread that weaves its way throughout my teaching and my work, on my research generally is thinking about the aspects of white women's racism specifically and the different nuances that it takes, the different forms of violence that it reinforces. And, I became really interested in this during my dissertation work. So thinking about these different, valences of white women's racism and thinking about in this particular iteration of that work with this article, thinking about how, women fall, specifically thinking about the ways that white women are inclined to, in various ways, find mechanisms to protect and shield themselves from different forms of criticism, but also thinking about the proximity to power is something that's a very powerful motivating force for white women. So I think that this comes into play particularly in the data and in this article by thinking about why white women will fall down these conspiracy thinking pipelines, and thinking about how the motivation to fall down these pipelines is often a desire to protect one's comfort and one's sense of innocence. So like I think about, for instance, with these, evangelical conservative white women, that tended to, were the majority of folks that, emerged in the data. Conspiracy thinking, like, Naomi Klein points this out, it gets the facts wrong, but the feelings right. And I think that with conspiracy thinking, particularly for white women, it does this work of shielding themselves from needing to look at different forms of truth. And it can help insulate them from needing to question their worldview. And so thinking about how this comes into play in a very powerful way with the Pastel QAnon women, because you think about, if you're in the space of reaching that fork in the road, like I was, articulating earlier, where you're like, okay, like things are not making sense. Like I have this feeling that, there are, aspects of life that are not quite making sense and something's being hidden from me. Instead of thinking about how you too are impacted by systemic power, but how you're impacted by patriarchy, how you're impacted by, the regressiveness of traditional gender roles, it's much easier to find a scapegoat. And it's much easier to, then follow the conspiracy thinking thread to say, actually, it's those people over there. And actually, it's a satanic cabal that's trying to kidnap my children at Target or whatever it is. But thinking about with that, it really does, I think that whiteness is, a really key variable here to further explore. And yeah, that's something that I'm interested in, looking towards.
Yeah, and I mean also, and I just started, Frankie and I have put in for a grant, and hopefully that, should we get this grant, that we'll be able to do some more work and look at, various MLMs beyond that recruit different cross sections of the population so that we can make some comparative. Where is it the same and where is it different? In the MLM industry, per se, even the structure of it in and of itself is just, it's blatantly racist. So I'll give you an example. So there is something that when I was looking through and doing some research and seeing like, where are there a lot of, Black women, let's say, going into these MLMs? A lot of them, some of it's like Herbalife, but there's another thing called the blessing loom, right? And a lot of those blessing looms speak to sort of these like micro loans, right? That, communities help with one another. And it was actually quite lucrative for a hot second with, and I forget the name of the couple escapes me, but it was like a reality TV show couple who were a prominent Black couple. And interestingly enough, even though they were scamming the people that they were recruiting into this, the government came in and shut them down, right? So we do have, this phenomenon of, the prosecution and the policing of these different MLMs is also inherently racist, because it was very fast to point out this particular couple and look how they're defrauding people, and they use this notion of they're defrauding people in the Black community, and that's not okay to do. But then on the other hand, going soft on these other MLMs that have become multi-million dollar industries, right? So even the structure itself, we have these inherently racist structures that are going in, that even like the policing and the way in which the laws on the books are being enforced has this white supremacist dimension within it, so that these organizations get to perpetuate. And like Frankie said, talking about making it feel good, and upholding white supremacy through these different like capitalist ventures.
Yeah. And it is important. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, James.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you for talking about it. I think we are heading into Q&A time.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe we can transition over to there, and maybe hopefully someone will have some more questions related to this so we can talk more on it. But yeah, do we pass it over, or the mic, the metaphorical mic?
Metaphorical mic. Yeah. Thank you, Janus, for leading that. And thank you, Frankie and Gina, for elaborating on everything that you've done. And it's just been a really good conversation. So when we move on to the Q&A, I want to ask all the participants to please put your questions and comments in the chat. And I will read them aloud for Dr. Mastrangelo and Dr. Longo to respond in the order that they're sent. Dr. Stam has been active in the chat. Thank you. And moderating questions, comments, and has submitted this question from Abigail, for a shout out, Abigail. How does this thinking place all of the responsibility on remedying systemic issues on the individual consumer? And how does it pit customers against one another, specifically women against women?
It's an excellent question.
Yeah, because I even think about that in, trying to consider forging paths forward. So like, as we were talking about what debunking campaigns could look like, they're even offering the suggestion of like, okay, how do you, leverage media ecologies where you bring in micro influencers to, shift the landscape of disinformation. I think that is, following your point, Abigail, right? Of that's like using in a lot of ways individual solutions. It could be seen as band-aid solutions to address different systemic problems. So yeah, it's difficult to think about, how it's one of those, particular topics, and, generally, this issue at large that we're dealing with that has, so many different tendrils and so many different rooted issues. So it would require, thinking thinking about economic precarity. It would require thinking about how various social institutions like, healthcare establishments and medical establishments, how they're, particularly reinforcing, different forms of, racism, sexism, ableism, and so on. Thinking about there's, a lot of, and platform capitalism, systemic oppression embedded in algorithms. There's, a lot at play here. But yeah, I'm curious, Gina, what comes to mind for you in thinking about how this, potentially proposes individual solutions to systemic problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and that's the way that we do like pit women against other women, right? Is instead of looking at the more systemic issue of like, let's look at like patriarchy and economic precarity and all of these issues that women face when they're going through the medical system as mothers, it's very easy to say, okay, well, the individual solution or the problem lies or the solution lies in the individual. And that gives people, I think, opportunity rather than to come together and say, how we can see how these issues are affecting all of us. We instead get to point fingers at one another and we get to reinforce like who's doing this individual action right or wrong. So I do think, and I think that also too, this whole idea of the individual solution and is part of that whole idea of girl boss feminism, is it not, Frankie?
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I'm even thinking about, how, in navigating different, digital platforms and collecting data from them and, really becoming a frequent user of like Reddit during this process and, the anti-MLM subreddit and realizing how often it is very easy for people to just kind of sit in a space of making fun of all of these, different, what they term MLM Huns, other, people will call them MLM girl bosses, boss babes, and like all of these, different ways of making fun of them. But I do think it's important to, connect that to what you were saying, Gina, that, it can be this way of, people tearing other people down. And I am continuously interested in how that takes shape, particularly with white women's racism. So thinking about how very often liberal white women will do this work of like disavowing their own complicity in white supremacy by saying, oh, but those women over there, they're like the really bad ones. And I think that, in this particular situation, when it comes to Pastel QAnon, it can be very easy to just say like, those Pastel QAnon women are like totally nuts. And like, I'm not one of them. Like, let's like point fingers at them and make fun of them. But, instead thinking about, what the inclination that people have to fall down these pipelines is not something that should be ignored and kind of dismissed and made fun of, but instead, interrogated and thought about critically, like how do these processes take shape and, not kind of writing it off as just like, like wacko individuals or something.
I'm curious, Gina and Frankie, did you find any different looks presented from different sources, like, Mormons looking different from evangelical Christians and like the intersection of religion, maybe?
Oh yeah, that is interesting. I don't know if we mentioned that like with essential oils, the most amount of essential oils MLMs are located in Utah. So there's, a high percentage of Mormon women that are involved in essential oil MLMs specifically. And it is something to point out. So how there's different, regional variations to the MLMs and MLMs, and not, I know that very often we conflate MLMs with pyramid schemes and, just to, be fair that not all forms of multi-level marketing function specifically as pyramid schemes, but in the cases that we were looking at, these, do operate as pyramid schemes. And thinking about, with different regions, like, in the South, people, may be familiar with, say, like LuLaRoe and how popular that was in like Virginia and North Carolina and different states. Like, I wonder if anybody here had, a family member that has a garage full of leggings that they didn't get to sell. But thinking about, these different multi-level marketing, companies, it does, take different, forms in different places. And with that, then there's, different variations when it comes to threads of Christianity too. Christian.
I noticed in the chat that, Danny asked, how does this discussion relate to social media trends, specifically on apps targeted at younger people on TikTok? And honestly, I have not done as much research, but I can do from my, using my sociological eye. I feel like in a lot of ways, TikTok has become sort of a medium that people can use as a format to sort of get this disinformation across. I mean, people find different social media platforms palatable, right? So if you ask certain groups, like how many people here are on Facebook or actively using Facebook, that's going to be different from people who is a generation of like Insta or TikTok or Snapchat. And the interesting thing is that the more and more advertising that I see as of late, especially like if I download a game, let's say on on my iPhone and I play it, very few, if any, of the commercials that come on are formal kind of, high definition, sophisticated professional commercials. It's a lot of this sort of TikTok-esque formatting. And I think that is, this could lead into a comfort zone where certain people feel that they're able to identify and say, like, I can see myself in that and consume some of that information. And it's not just for, I will say that, TikTok has a lot of, younger folks on it, but there is also a lot of misinformation that is targeted towards seniors. And I know this from watching my own mother and her friends who are over 70 years old, who are on the senior TikToks. And there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation that goes out there. And some of it's very benign, like, oh, I heard they're coming up with another season of Game of Thrones. And I'm like, that thing ended, like, where did you see that? Or where did you see that, Auntie? And it's like, I saw it on TikTok and I thought, so I think in some ways that with, younger people on TikTok, there's different approaches depending on the age group. And I mean, that intersection is different, but I feel like TikTok has become more and more of a format and a platform for disseminating disinformation for different kinds of people. Cause, there is, a very high attrition rate in moderators. So only so much disinformation can get taken out through the algorithm. There are people that are behind the scenes that are looking at videos that are being reported, and the turnover rate is very, very high for those people, because on top of the misinformation that they're getting and having to look through, there's also a lot of violence that they need to look at. There's also a lot of, horrific stuff that people put on TikTok that's very dark. And it's very stressful to people. And a lot of times that moderation work is contractual. So not getting, it's almost like a gig work in a sense. And so there's, I think it makes TikTok a very easy way to disseminate that kind of misinformation, given that perfect storm.
Yeah, and I also, in relation to your question, Danny, I'm also thinking about how on TikTok with, different younger, like niche kind of micro influencers, how these different political economies of digital disinformation can take shape in terms of, unique iterations of, systems of rewards and incentives. So like, for instance, with, young people on TikTok if they start, if they, are contacted by, say a particular supplement company or, whatever it is, like detox tea, I'm sure you all have seen, different examples of this, how then them participating in sharing like discount codes with, their followers, and then, essentially, functioning as, its own, peer-to-peer distribution for a particular MLM that can take so many different forms, obviously outside of essential oils, but it is, disturbing to see younger people getting involved in that because, I think about how, and I'm sure, people may have seen, things to this effect too, how many young people are aspiring to being an influencer as a career. So like thinking about people younger and younger, wanting to, build a following so that that can be their career. So with that, wanting to, willfully engage in those different, political economies of, incentives and rewards to build a name for yourself in some way. But it's delicate though, right? Because then, people don't want to be seen as they're like, just a brand, so people will like integrate, coupon codes in unique and creative ways. And like very often, I know people will just roll their eyes. They're like, okay, this is like getting to a brand deal. They're about to like pitch me a product in some way, but people are trying to do it in like more subtle and, comical ways more and more. So that's interesting to see too.
I also think too that, if we start to do some, and I think a little bit, this might, speak a little bit to Carrie's question about, what would be useful to looking into conspiracy topics. I think the way that, even our youngest viewers that are out there in the world and seeing how certain information, how the pump gets primed. And, just as an example, so my children love to watch YouTube. I have kids YouTube for them, and I'm very stringent in how I let them watch. There are a lot of child influencers out there. I mean, Ryan's World is a big one that's out there. And then, also, the Ninja Kids, and the content, seems very benign in the sense that it's like, oh, these kids are playing or they're looking at but the evolution of the video as they're getting more and more sophisticated or getting more and more followers with their channels, the more messaging that sort of comes out. One of the things that what I've been looking at with that is I noticed that, how many of these influencers are, talking about wealth in a particular way. So for example, with the Ninja Kids, it's a family and they're like into karate and gymnastics, and they go all over the place, and they have a very particular way in which they're bringing up their kids. And one of the boys who turned 16 years old, he was able to buy a car outright with his earnings from the YouTube. And they made a big, huge YouTube about that. And the message was, you're a loser if you're using credit as a way to get, you should save up and buy things. And it's these little tiny messages that get stuck in the head that, become like sort of common sense. I had to talk to my children about this. Like when that came up, we had to say, let's think about the privilege behind whether or not someone is able to save up $30,000 for a car, because I certainly cannot do that. And it's so these little messages and how, a lot of misinformation is even being fed to our children, whether it's a value system or something as flat out as, somebody said the other day, my son said, oh, a boy in our class said that, if you drink too much water, your eyes will become blurry. And they had got that off of YouTube. And the parent in the class at the time that the kid said that to was a mom that was reading to the class and said, oh, well, that's not real. That's a form of entertainment. And I said to my son, what do you think is entertaining about that? Do you think that that information about that wrong information is helpful? Is it somehow funny? And just kind of breaking that down. So even looking at some of these ways in which, you know, the digital space, the education system, and how they all connect to these different authorities, and how we're educating our children as they're getting into, you know, the digital, you know, digital content younger and younger, is really might be an important place to start looking at, you know, the nexus of like conspiracy theories, consumption on digital spaces, and different areas of authority.
Yeah, something in relation to CJ's question that I'm thinking of as well is like the sociologist Guy Standing talks about new formations of economic precarity today. And so different formations of, essentially we need to update our understandings of social stratification and think about how we conceptualize who is the proletariat or the precariat, as he puts it. And he talks a great deal about how atavism and, you know, in other words, this longing for a past that never was, which is, you know, another way of thinking about the Make America Great Again, alt-right pipeline as well, thinking about how conspiracy theories are, you know, truly running rampant amongst that formation of precarity. So like thinking about how there's such an appeal of atavism, this, you know, nostalgia for a past that never was. And, you know, we see this through the trad wife aesthetic. We see this through, you know, the MLMs that we were looking at with, you know, the majority of folks that were engaged in these spaces. So thinking about, you know, being able to recommend to scholars that we should not just, you know, kind of turn a blind eye to how these different forms of conspiracy thinking are taking shape. Like QAnon is just, it's not just a passing phase that, you know, we can kind of scoff our noses at and, you know, just disregard in different ways, but thinking about how digital spaces are making it possible for these different forms of conspiracy thinking to flourish because of new formations of economic precarity, and thinking about how atavism is, you know, a key thread that's, you know, running through that. So yeah, I appreciated that question.
I think Abigail asks a really good question about, you know, because Frankie, I remember in the first iteration, you know, Abigail's asking like, could you talk about how these MLMs and anti-vaxxers have like co-opted, you know, Eastern medicinal practices? And, you know, that was something that when I read the first draft of the paper when I was coming on to that, um, we had to take out because it is its own paper, right?
Yeah.
So probably know a lot more about that data.
Yeah, and yeah. So the folks that were putting together the special collection for social media and society suggested to me that this thread that I had included in the first draft of the paper that was interrogating the ways that MLM peer distributors were engaging different forms of cultural appropriation with how they were talking about indigenous communities. And I was really interested in this thread of how that was being used as a marketing ploy, and how you know, it was not only being used as a marketing ploy, but it was, you know, doing this work of defining indigenous identity through this lens of vagueness that we often see in different, and Susan could also speak to this too, like the ways in like different white wellness spaces, there's this sense of like, oh, it's magical. It comes from indigenous communities. And then with that, it does this work of dehumanizing, you know, different indigenous folks and kind of reducing them to these, you know, familiar tropes and stereotypes. And we saw that in the data, you know, in such a profound way. And so that's, you know, definitely bookmarked for me, and, you know, as a thread that, you know, I'd like to continue exploring. So yeah, thinking about the ways that, you know, the reduction of, you know, indigenous identity took shape, thinking about how, you know, we really need to consider how cultural appropriation takes shape in more nuanced ways, because I think very often this is also connected, to social media culture, but, people can say like, oh, that's cultural appropriation. And then it's like, like that's cultural appropriation. You can't do that. Like, let's just put it away. But I think it requires, a more thorough discussion of what are the broader stakes of cherry picking aspects of other people's cultures and using them for branding, marketing, reducing people to stereotypes, instead of just leaving the conversation at like, you shouldn't culturally appropriate. So I think that that's, also, connected to, this conversation as well. I appreciate that.
There's a question from CJ specifically for you, Dr. Longo. I'm gonna butcher this pronunciation, but following Anne-Marie Dowse. Okay, great. Moral economy of suspicion. You said it on a podcast about your keeping it in the family article that if you're going to have a moral economy of something, you need to have moral currency. How do you define the moral currency of Pastel QAnon distributors, and how does that relate to the moral currency you studied in keeping it in the family? Additionally, what are some macro trends that you've uncovered after having done both of these projects?
Thank you so much for asking that question. So yeah, I do talk about that. So just as a background for some people, the moral economy of suspicion is, a phenomenon in family migration. So when you attempt to, bring a spouse into the United States and you're a US citizen, instead of looking at, the logical, you have to prove to the government that your relationship is not just for immigration papers, but that you have a, genuine kind of a relationship. And the idea of the moral economy of suspicion is the powers that be, instead of looking to see objective notions of fraud being committed, they tend to look at the racialized and gendered understandings of what they think a family should look like. And so that creates this moral economy of suspicion, because people who do not look like the, quote, all-American family tend to be typified as suspicious. And, and I argue later on in another paper that, there's a moral currency that goes around that other people need to, that people who are filing also need to engage in this moral economy of suspicious. They try to put forward what it looks like to be a real family, drawing on certain character statuses and certain performances of family in order to demonstrate to the government that they really are who they say they are, and that they're deserving of a visa. With that kind of a background, the moral currency here is these moral ideas of family. And again, I actually do see an overlap here, because when you're looking at things like, the Save the Children and Pastel QAnon, it's really about saving, white children and white families, right? And there's a lot of this fear going on about, and we hear this in the alt-right movement, the genocide of white people and, and all of that stuff. And I think that, a lot of the trad wife stuff also feeds into this. There's this whiteness component there of, saving, the real white family. And I think that this feeds in very well, because for those influencers who are successful, they are able to purport that moral kind of currency of like looking like the right family. They draw on the proper, character status assets of their whiteness and their gendered roles. And they also do a sort of performative kind of family. And that, and people tend to get, people judge based on that, right? So whether or not you're going to get more people to buy your product or you're going to get more people to watch your channel depends on how well you're able to do that. And that is part of that moral currency. And of course, if you come into the movement and you yourself are trying to establish yourself as probably a credible person in the movement, or you're trying to push that forward, you also need to figure out a way to do that, even if you don't necessarily look like that family stereotypically. There's ways in which that people mute certain things about themselves and accentuate other things in order to convey a particular image. And that's the overlap that I see between these different like moral currencies. Because a lot of the ways in which we define what nation is in the United States, a lot of the ways in which we define citizenry and who is deserving of what in this country is based on this understanding of family, which has been historically, you know, white and patriarchal and middle class. So that all feeds into that. I hope that answers the question satisfactorily.
Does anyone else have any more questions before we move on to any closing statements? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
I did just want to note that I have an article about the Ruby Frank situation bookmarked right now because I don't know the story behind that. So thank you, Abigail, for reminding me to look into that.
I also thought it was a really cool suggestion to do, you know, maybe a topics course one of these days about the family influencer content. I mean, that's something, if anybody has ideas for certain classes, particularly around digital sociology content, you know, Dr. Stam, Dr. Mastrangelo, and I are the digital sociologists here on faculty, and we're always looking to see like, what is it that, you know, you want to learn and what you want to take, and how we can be doing sociology in different areas so that when you go out into your careers or to graduate school, that, you know, you have as much information as you have so that you can study and pioneer the way for change. So keep us posted.
Ryder, yes, me too. I really do feel that. That
Me
would
too,
Well, Ryder, you must try to come to our, you must apply for our graduate program, and hopefully that we'll see you there, and then you can contribute to the conversation.
You're being recruited, basically.
Recruiting,
Our MLM.
yes. Head over to our site and apply.
All right, well, if there are no other questions, I'm not seeing any, but so I'm gonna move on to our closing statements. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to you, Dr. Gina Marie Longo and Dr. Frankie Mastrangelo, for taking the time to engage us in a discussion about your guys' article. And I really want to thank you, Janus, for moderating today's discussion and giving us some really thought-provoking questions that allowed us to dive deeper into Dr. Mastrangelo's and Dr. Longo's research. Lastly, thank you to Dr. Tara Stam for taking the time to be here and moderate the chat room and all of your additional support today. All of that being said, thank you to everyone here for attending and taking the time out of your day to engage with us. And the Digital Sociology Lab appreciates all of your support. We really hope to see you again at any of our other future events. Stay tuned for our next Black Cyberfeminism speaker series taking place in early April. Dr. John Johnson will be joining our Digital Sociology Lab fellow and sociology graduate student, Amaya McNeil. Hi, Amaya. For conversations about Dr. Johnson's work. Her areas of interest include feminist research, Black feminism, and digital media studies, applying a lens of intersectionality, gender studies, social media studies, critical race feminism, and social justice matters. There are more details coming soon, so keep an eye on the Digital Sociology Lab's website for updates, as well as emails if you're on our list. Lastly, I would like to remind everyone that VCU Sociology Master's Program accepts applications until June 1st. So head over to the department's website to learn how you can get a master's in sociology, including a concentration in digital sociology. Apply early to be considered for teaching assistantships as well. So on behalf of the Digital Sociology Lab, thank you again for your engagement today, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all so much. This was so much fun. I mean, this was just so great. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
I
you
loved
all so
everyone's
much for coming.
questions.
Yeah.
And thank you, Ava, for, setting the stage for everything and closing us out.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
amazing job. Thank
Oh,
you
thank
so
you.
much. You
This
did
is-
a lot of hard work. Thank you, Ava. We couldn't have done this without you for real.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Well, everyone, have a great evening, and thanks to everyone for coming out.
Mhm.
I'll see y'all.
You again.
Bye.
Bye.